This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. So there's a lot of attention on generational groups lately. The most recent focus is the tension between millennials and boomers. Don't roll your eyes yet. We wanted to have a productive conversation about the millennial generation for a portion of the show today. The Connecticut Health Investigative Team, or CHIT, reported a recent story that millennials, or people between the ages of 23 and 38, are seeing growing rates of major depression in recent years. We wanted to know more, so in studio with me now is Valerie LaPoutre, who's statewide Young Adult Program Coordinator for the Connecticut chapter of the National Alliance for Mental Illness, or NAMI. Valerie, welcome to our show.
Hi, thank you for having me, Lucy.
And our listeners can join us as well. The number 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Valerie, we invited you into the studio because you were actually featured in this Connecticut Health Investigative Team article, which will be on our website at WNPR.org/Where We Live, focusing on millennial mental health. And so tell me, we thought it was really interesting when we saw this statistic that major depression among millennials is growing in recent years, up 31% from 2014 to 2017. Is that a surprising statistic for someone who works for NAMI?
I'm not really surprised. I mean, nationally, even all throughout the spectrum of ages, depression has risen too. So for millennial generation, we're in that working field now, graduating from college and experiencing like the economy changes and everything going on right now. So I'm not surprised.
You said we, so you're someone who's in the millennial generation?
Yeah, I guess I'm technically in the tail end because I'm 25, so 1994. So, yeah.
And so when you said that depression is actually going up among different age groups nationwide, what are some of the reasons for that?
I think there's some different factors. There's a lot of trauma that I think that we've experienced growing up. So if you're looking at the higher rates of depression, there's also like an increase of cardiovascular disease and other issues going on. So when I think about trauma, I think about like the ACEs score. So those who might have experienced some adverse childhood experiences have a higher rate or increase of depression and other health condition issues.
You help with some support groups that NAMI has around the state that are focusing in on millennials. Tell us about when these groups started and, who are the people that are coming to you?
So they started, I think, back in 2014 was when they originally boomed. But I jumped in 2017. I started as a facilitator of one of the groups in Middletown, and then I kind of changed the model a little bit because I felt that the focus was primarily on illness, and we needed to focus more on wellness and the 8 dimensions of wellness to help young people thrive in their communities. So in addition to just talking about managing their mental health, there's also, financial, physical health, spiritual growth, everything that young people need in order to be successful as adults. So, yeah.
And so you had mentioned that you are considered millennial, and you've also dealt with some mental health challenges. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that influences the work of these support groups that you're part of?
Sure. So I can tell you that I was a very anxious child growing up. I started to experience depressive symptoms, I guess you'd say, around 17 years old. And I was very academically driven. So even though things were kind of crumbling around me, my academics were very, very strong. But when I reached my senior year in high school, I was starting to feel the effects so much that I wasn't showing up to school. My grades were dropping a little bit. And that's when I kind of realized I needed to put college on hold. And that kind of messed with my identity in a little bit because I worked so hard to do so well in my academics. So I think what for me was I transformed that experience of needing to take time off and figuring out how to move out of the house, how to be an adult, have my own apartment, take care of my family, take care of my own needs. And I figured this seems to be very common for a lot of young people, whether they're still on their parents' insurance or they're looking to get off their parents' insurance or they're being kicked off their parents' insurance. or they don't really know where to begin with taking care of themselves. A lot of people who experience depression might find it harder to hold a job. So a lot of the themes that I see even in our groups, people talking about, how do I take care of myself? How do I tell my employer if I might be experiencing some depression or other mental health challenges? What does that look like if they kick me out because I missed work because I was sick, because I had some mental health challenges? Even how do I make sure I fit in my schedule, coping skills? Because when it comes to health, you have to figure out ways to manage it. And when it comes to your mental health, it's the same thing. So we kind of embedded that in our support group model.
How do you answer some of those questions that these young people may have, especially if they're dealing with an illness and they worry if it's disclosed to their employer that there'll be repercussions?
So we always refer them to even like the Connecticut Legal Rights Project. And also with NAMI, we have programs that teach people how to disclose as well. And even with like our Ending the Silence program, we teach young people to be able to transform their experience to teach other people about their lived experience to help promote that that common talk about mental health. We also look for other young people in the group for their feedback because we think that shared conversation really does help a lot.
You're hearing Valerie LaPoutre, statewide young adult program coordinator for the Connecticut chapter of the National Alliance for Mental Illness, or NAMI, as we learn about support groups that are geared towards people who are considered millennials, again, between the ages of 23 and 38. If you're one of them and you've wondered about support for you, if you're dealing with a mental health illness, you can join our conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Valerie, as part of your personal story, you mentioned that you were dealing with a lot of pressures and it impacted your abilities where you didn't feel like you were ready quite for college. When we talk about just some of the stressors that young people are facing today, is it seem more and more prevalent that young people don't have the ways to cope with certain stresses and they need to find other ways of help, such as these support groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think I grew up in a very small town, so it was expected for us to go straight from high school to college. And so even when I graduated high school and I didn't start college soon enough, I had a lot of people in the community coming up to me. I was working at a local pharmacy, and they were like, Valerie, I thought you were going to Hofstra University. What's going on? And I felt very ashamed of that experience. So I think for a lot of people, that stigma of, well, I can't really tell you why I might not be going to college, or I'm not really even sure how to navigate that. Some people haven't finished high school. They don't know how to navigate, getting their credits, So I think for my own personal experience, being able to like take that challenge and kind of flip it and look at it on the positive light of, I'm taking care of myself. My mental health is the most important thing right now. And I don't have to explain that to anybody, but I'm going to someday use that to help other people.
When we think about mental health services, are there enough service providers in our state to deal with people who may need extra support, whether it's going to a therapist or just being part of a support group, even substance abuse issues, which we know is a growing issue not just here but nationwide?
Well, we know that 1 in 5 people have experienced some type of depression, and we know suicide's the second leading cause of death for young people. So I don't know if we have necessarily enough providers, but a lot of it, too, is a lot of people who are even on commercial insurance are having a hard time finding providers that take their insurance. And even if people choose to take medication to treat their mental health challenges, some providers don't even accept insurance. So access to care is huge, and it's not. We need to work on that.
And so if that is an issue that someone in your support group brings up, how do you help them resolve that? Especially if, say, a young person has been on their parents' insurance until 26, and then after that they need to find insurance, whether it's employer-based or signing up for the exchange. How do they navigate that?
So we focus a lot on Access Health. I used to work as a peer specialist, peer supporter, working with that transition age youth, and I would sit down and we would call together. even if it was trying to get them on Husky or whatever kind of Medicaid insurance plan that they need that fits their experiences. So the power of working together. Some people are just so overwhelmed that they can't do it themselves. But if you have a group of people saying, "Hey, let's work on this together as a goal," then that can help somebody exponentially.
You mentioned suicide. You also lead suicide prevention workshops. The rates of suicide increasing nationwide for all age groups from 1999 to 2017, according to the federal CDC. For people who want to know more, if they need help, where can they go, Valerie?
Well, Connecticut has PreventSuicideCT.org. It's the Connecticut Suicide Advisory Board. They're also more than welcome to contact us at NAMI Connecticut. We have our own programs that we work with the Suicide Advisory Board. And, of course, AFSP, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, has a lot of programs as well.
There's also a National Suicide Prevention Lifeline that I can give the number out, 1-800-273-8255. You can also call 211 in Connecticut. Valerie, we talked about these support groups that you're helping facilitate. For listeners who want to know more, especially if they're in that millennial age range, where can they go to learn more?
On our website, www.namict.org. We have a whole list of all the different types of support groups out there. We even offer substance prevention, substance use support groups for family members and for those experiencing challenges with substances and other addictive-related issues, too.
I'm going to thank Valerie LaPoutre for joining us. She's statewide young adult program coordinator for the Connecticut chapter of the National Alliance for Mental Illness, or NAMI. Again, we'll have more information on our website, wnpr.org/where we live. Valerie, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you so much, Lucy.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. After the break, we're going to shift our focus to Hong Kong, which saw record turnout in local elections on Sunday. After the island has seen pro-democracy demonstrations for the last 6 months, we're going to learn about why that is. And you can learn more, too. Just keep listening, and you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Have you been watching what's happening in Hong Kong?
Just hours after Patrick Chow was shot by police during a demonstration, another man was set on fire allegedly by protesters, and it was one of the most dramatic days in over 5 months of protests.
That's a clip from CNN about the shooting of protester Patrick Chow by Hong Kong police. That was back on November 11th. Now, pro-democracy protesters have been taking to the streets in Hong Kong for nearly 6 months, and it's having an impact. Most recently, it turned an otherwise sleepy election into one with a high voter turnout. The New York Times reporting the surge in voting, especially by young people, allowed democracy advocates to win many more seats on local councils, and a sign that Hong Kong residents are unhappy with the Chinese government. Coming up, we'll talk about how the demonstrations, some violent, have affected the way people in Hong Kong view its police. Reporter Alan Yu will join us. First, we wanted to better understand what's going on in Hong Kong, an island that operates like it's its own country, but it's actually not. Hong Kong is a Chinese territory. For more, joining us by phone is Yuen Chan, senior lecturer in the Department of Journalism at the City University of London. She was also a longtime Hong Kong-based journalist. Yuen, welcome to our show.
Good morning, Lucy.
Can we start with the news, Yuen? What is your response to this record turnout we're hearing from these elections on Sunday?
Well, obviously, there was some jubilation among supporters of the pro-democracy forces in Hong Kong this morning because there was a record turnout rate of more than 71%. That's 2.9 million out of an electorate of 4.1 million people. And what we saw was almost a clean sweep of the 18 district councils of Hong Kong. 17 of them are now in the control of the pro-democracy parties and groupings in Hong Kong. So that's obviously a very good showing, and what it shows is that it's a slap in the face of the government, which has seemed to be very intransigent to people's demands, primarily for a independent commission of inquiry into alleged police brutality and the way that they've handled these protests, which is now a key demand, along with having truly free and open elections for both the Hong Kong's Legislative Council and Chief Executive by universal suffrage. So that's what we've essentially seen today. But we've also seen people saying that it's okay. This is the first time in the last 5 or 6 months that we've genuinely been allowed to be happy, but we've still got a lot of work to do. And people are very aware of the fact that their struggle is far from over, and that in fact there are still some protesters holed up in one of the university campuses where they've been for over a week now. So there, and some of the winning candidates marched down to that university campus to show the protesters there that they've not been forgotten.
We've talked about, or mentioned at least, these protests have been going on for nearly 6 months, but we wanted some more context about Hong Kong and its relationship with China. When we look at Hong Kong today, it looks like a democracy. We're talking about elections, but not technically a truly democratic system, Yuan?
You're absolutely right, and I think that the way that you characterized it, it looks like a democracy, is part of the problem. From the outside, people see elections taking place, they appear to be free and fair, and so a lot of people will come to the conclusion that Hong Kong is a democracy. The situation in Hong Kong is that what you actually have had for a long time, and this even predates 1997 to the colonial times under the British, is that Hong Kong was a free society. So it's a society that had freedom of the press, freedom of information, people can freely publish, and it has an independent judiciary, but it is not fully democratic. So the elections that we just saw, that just took place, they're for local councils, they're called district councils, and these elections are actually by far the most democratic of Hong Kong's elections, because nearly all of the seats are actually elected by one person, one vote, single vote system. But the Legislative Council, which is one step high, is the higher level of legislature in Hong Kong, is a very strange kind of hybrid creature. So there are 70 seats overall in that council. 30 of them are elected via proportional representation according to geographical constituency. So those are fully democratic as one would understand that term. But a further 30 are actually composed of what are called functional constituencies. That means there are 30 members of the council who represent certain interests in Hong Kong. And these can range from the insurance sector to the legal sector, engineering, banking, finance, tourism, education, and so on. And what you have there is that you have a far smaller number of people, a much more limited franchise, returning 30 members to the Legislative Council. So in effect, that means that in the last Legislative Council elections, you had around 3.7 million ordinary voters voting for 35 seats. And on the other hand, you have around 226,000 voters electing 30 members. So that's a really disparate number there. And just to give you an example, for instance, in the insurance functional constituency, 141 electors, mainly corporate bodies, will vote for one member of the council. And so within even the functional constituencies, there's a huge disparity, because while 141 insurance sector members vote for one member of the council, on the other hand, 36,000 or nearly 36,500 members of the health services workers, health sector workers, will also elect one member. So you can see from that example what a gaping gap there is in terms of the franchise. And that's an example of how why a lot of Hong Kongers feel that their system is rigged.
I wanted to just remind our listeners, I'm speaking with Yuen Chan, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Journalism at the City University of London. Also, she was a longtime Hong Kong-based journalist. We wanted to learn more about these demonstrations, what led to the demonstrations in Hong Kong. Again, this is a territory of mainland China. You mentioned the roots of it being a British colony. So let's back up a little bit, Yuen, and talk about what happened in 1997. This handover from Great Britain to the UK, and how Hong Kong functions as a territory of China.
Right. So Britain had administered Hong Kong since the 1840s as a colony of the United Kingdom. So this is a result of some treaties that were signed at the end of the 19th century. There were actually three treaties, one which ceded the island of Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity. But the sticking point is really with the treaty on some land called the New Territories in Hong Kong, which was ceded to Britain on a 99-year lease. And what happened was in the late 70s and the 80s, the question of new leases and loans issued in Hong Kong, would they still be valid after that lease expired? So there was a need for Britain to negotiate with China and decide on the future of Hong Kong. And during that time, it became clear, despite what Britain had wanted at the time was to continue to administer Hong Kong. But this was flatly rejected by the Chinese side. And so negotiations had to begin about Hong Kong's future. And eventually in 1984, a document called the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed by these two sides, under which Britain agreed to cede sovereignty of Hong Kong to the Chinese side, and that Hong Kong would become a special administrative region of China after 1997, on the condition of this policy called one country, two systems, which means that Hong Kong would retain a high degree of autonomy, and that its way of life would be unchanged for 50 years, and that all of this would be enshrined in the basic law, which people popularly call Hong Kong's mini-constitution. And this would ensure that Hong Kong would continue to enjoy a free press, the capitalist economic system, and an independent judiciary and legal system, its own currency, and so on and so forth. So that was the basis upon which Britain transferred sovereignty of Hong Kong over to the People's Republic of China in 1997.
I understand there have been tensions prior to this year where protests have formed among Hong Kong residents, I guess in 2003, and then most recently back in 2014, also known as the Umbrella Movement. What led to those protests, Yuen?
Well, in 2003, Hong Kong had just been through a difficult time with SARS economically. But what was the trigger for the 2003 protests was the government of the time, the Hong Kong government of the time, wanted to introduce a national security law. It's popularly called the Article 23 because Article 23 of the Basic Law stipulates that Hong Kong must on its own enact national security legislation. At the time, a lot of Hong Kong people were very dissatisfied with that because they saw that they could see that it would become an infringement on their primarily free speech and expression. And so a lot of people took to the streets. It was actually 500,000 people at least, which at the time was quite unprecedented. And this eventually led to that legislation, that proposed legislation being withdrawn, and also eventually to the resignation of the then chief executive of Hong Kong. So that was in 2003. In 2014, was really the trigger for that was the fact that Hong Kong people had been for so many years striving to see the promises of having free, fair elections by universal suffrage of their leader, the chief executive, and also full democratic elections for the Legislative Council. And this had been delayed and delayed. There were blueprints that were put forward and then sort of scuppered or found unsatisfactory, and in any case, they did not get the elections that they wanted. And so 2014 was about that. And they decided that they would show through civil disobedience, because every other method had failed, their resolve to achieve that aim.
And so now, fast forward to 2019, these recent protests again, starting, I guess it's been almost 6 months. It started peaceful, but then there have been violent clashes. Why has the movement changed, Yuen?
Primarily, I would say it's been a response to the police use of force. What happened was at the beginning of June, there was a huge peaceful demonstration of 1 million people asking for the withdrawal of a controversial extradition bill that would have paved the way for anybody in Hong Kong to be extradited for trial and imprisonment in mainland China. And the government's reaction to that was seen as highly unsatisfactory. It refused to withdraw or even postpone the bill. And this very intransigent and aloof, arrogant response led to people deciding that they needed to take more forceful action. And what they tried to do was they took to the streets. Some people took to the streets and surrounded the Legislative Council to prevent the further reading of the bill that would have allowed that legislation to pass. And on that day, the police responded with lots of tear gas and with rubber bullets. And this was very unprecedented and unheard of in Hong Kong, to have that level of force against protesters. So as a result of that, the government thought that people would not come and protest so much, but the following weekend, 2 million people came out. And
Yuen, who are these people? I know that in press reports it's often described as a movement led by young people, but is that accurate?
So there are definitely a lot of young people out there on the streets, and a lot of the frontline protesters that you see and the people involved in the more radical actions are primarily young people. Even if just for the sheer fact that you need to have a lot of physical stamina in order to engage in those kinds of protests. But behind those young people, there are a lot of very wide swathes of Hong Kong society who are basically supporting the movement's demands, that being originally the withdrawal of the bill and the establishment of an independent inquiry into the police actions and for universal suffrage. So there is huge support for that within society, and opinion poll after opinion poll have shown that. They've shown a complete breakdown of trust, really, in the Hong Kong police force and an overwhelming demand for greater political reform. So that cuts across society, and I think that's reflected in the district council election results as well, because you would not have got the results that we got if it were only young people voting for Democratic candidates.
Yuen Chan is Senior Lecturer in the Department of Journalism at the City University of London, joining us today via phone on Where We Live as we get more context on the situation on the ground in Hong Kong. Again, nearly 6 months of pro-democracy demonstrations. There have been violent clashes with police. We're going to be talking more about that coming up here on Where We Live. Yuen, you gave us some good background on the relationship between Hong Kong and China, but I'm curious how people in Hong Kong today identify themselves. Is there a generational divide? I understand there's a term Hong Kongers. Are older residents, do they see themselves as Chinese before they see themselves as Hong Kongers?
Well, this is something that's been happening since 1997. There have been polls that have tracked the way Hong Kong people identify themselves. And I think it's easy now to look and say, oh, well, Hong Kongers reject being Chinese. But it's important to remember that this was never an inevitability. So in the early years after the handover, in fact, you saw a rise in the percentage of Hong Kong people who saw themselves as either Chinese or Chinese Hong Kongers, or Hong Kongers who were also Chinese. And really, it's been in the since 2008 that has begun to turn around. And in 2014, beginning 2014, it's plummeted even further as it continues to do so today. And among the young, that is especially the case. So especially among the young, it's the case that youngsters do not see themselves as Chinese and increasingly see themselves as Hong Kongers. It is a generational divide, but it doesn't mean that that all older people identify merely as Chinese, because we also have to think about what it means to be Chinese. And a lot of older generation of Hong Kong people, or people in Hong Kong, may identify with being culturally Chinese, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they support the regime, the ruling regime in China. And what you've seen in recent years is that increasingly Beijing has sort of pushed this idea of conflating the state and the political power in China with the notion of what it means to be Chinese. And the more that it does that, the more it will push away Hong Kongers who do not identify with the regime, I think.
You're talking to us here in Connecticut. For many of us, Hong Kong may not be on our radar. How has the U.S. and other nations responded to, again, these demonstrations in Hong Kong? And also when we think about our country's relationship with China, how that all should be taken into account, Yuan?
Well, I think that for people in Hong Kong, the international community's response to their struggle is very important, and they definitely take a lot of solace in the support that they get internationally. So there is the moral impact, I think, is very important. But there are also more practical things. We saw in the U.S. that all the attempts, not attempts, but what the Senate and Congress have done to pass the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. A lot of people in Hong Kong support that. It's seen as a real boon. Of course, we still don't know yet if President Trump will sign it. So people will be looking towards that. I guess some of them are very disappointed in the fact that the president has sort of tried to, some of the comments that he made about he's the only reason that the PLA haven't obliterated Hong Kong yet, and trying to use Hong Kong as a pawn in in his trade war with China. We have seen support for Hong Kong from various Western countries, and this is welcome. And I think Hong Kong people would like to see more, really.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest today, Yuan Chan, senior lecturer in the Department of Journalism at the City University of London. She was a longtime Hong Kong-based journalist. Again, violent demonstrations in Hong Kong have subsided, but the protests have damaged how some residents view the Hong Kong police. We're going to talk more about that after the break. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Where We Live's coming to a coffee shop near you. We're hosting a coffee break at local coffee shops around Connecticut to hear from you. What issue or story in your community is not getting the attention it needs? You can join the Where We Live team at Silk City Coffee in Manchester, Connecticut. That's Tuesday, December 10th. You can learn more at our Facebook page. Just search Where We Live. Now, today we've been focusing on Hong Kong after nearly 6 months of pro-democracy demonstrations there. Some of those protests have turned violent with clashes between residents and police, most recently at Hong Kong's Polytechnic University. The demonstrations started because of an extradition bill, but but now the protests are largely about how the police have handled the protests. Joining us for more context from WHYY in Philadelphia is Alan Yu, a reporter for The Pulse, a health and science show who's reported stories from and about Hong Kong for WHYY and This American Life. Alan, welcome to Where We Live.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I should mention to our listeners, we're very fond of Alan. He came through Connecticut several years ago during an NPR training, so great to hear from you, Alan.
It's lovely to be on.
Now, I should tell our listeners, you also grew up in Hong Kong, and so as a child, what were your impressions of the Hong Kong police?
Yes, that's right. I spent the most of my life in Hong Kong, and I would say that as far as I can remember, the Hong Kong police were always sort of trusted authority figures. If you look at a lot of the pop culture that's created around Hong Kong from the time when I was growing up, and I am a child of the 90s, they were very respected. I mean, we have many shows where they were treated as heroes. They're the people who come in to, uphold law and order in Hong Kong. So I think they had the public's trust for as far as I can remember.
From your time in Hong Kong, especially during these protests over the last 6 months, that feeling among residents has changed, again, because of violence. But tell us what you've been hearing from Hong Kongers directly.
Yeah, so I think that there have been sort of, as far as I can tell, two major turning points. One, as you and Yuan have discussed, was the 2015 or 2014 umbrella movement. That I think was, a big change when we saw the police tear gassing protesters, and also there was one very controversial incident where 7 police officers were seen on camera kicking and beating an activist who was already in custody, and that case wound up through the court system, and I believe those officers were actually convicted. And so that was one major turning point when it came to how the Hong Kong people and the police saw each other. And then during this year's anti-extradition bill protests, as both you and Yuan have brought up, that trust has even further broken down as you see the police using even more violent tactics than they did in 2015, using tear gas, batons, rubber bullets, pepper spray, and including in recent weeks when they've sort of waged war on some college campuses even.
We should note that there are protesters that have also been attacking police officers. And so that really adds to the tension, Alan, during these demonstrations, particularly at these college campuses. But you did a couple of stories that we really wanted to highlight. Before we get to this sit-down that you did with a man and his son who you grew up with in Hong Kong, you also looked into the science of protests and how police should respond to demonstrations. What did you learn?
Yes, so the kind of impetus for the story was basically I've been seeing a lot of the coverage, and like many of my friends and peers from Hong Kong were shocked at seeing how the police cracked down on the protesters. And so I wondered, well, I'm a science reporter, and so I wondered, is this really the best way to deal with protests, and how do police forces around the world sort of deal with the crowd psychology problem of what is the best way to handle protests so that they end peacefully? And what I found was that actually both in the UK and here in the US, there have been other police officers who found ways of handling protests that could end peacefully. So, for example, I'll take the U.S. example. There was a police chief who was the police chief of Madison, Wisconsin in the 1970s in the height of the anti-Vietnam War protests. And, this was a very tense time, right? You had police, beating protesters, using tear gas on college campuses. And this young police chief sort of came in and thought, this really isn't working for us very well. What can we do differently? And so he instructed his officers to not go in with force, to talk to the protesters, figure out what they want, and sort of explain to them that police are there to protect their right to protest. protest, and that the police serve to uphold democracy and make sure that people can express their thoughts peacefully. And that ended up being, what the research shows. I mentioned there's been research in the UK also that says that, if you go about and think of the protesters not as this kind of mindless mob of people who are criminals, but you think of them as just people who want to make a point, and the role of the police is to figure out how do we help them make that point with the minimum amount of conflict, then that really can't end well.
You mentioned this evidence-based practices that have worked, but police departments don't all adopt that tactic where they are all geared up and they are definitely looking very intimidating. But at the same time, they're responsible for controlling crowds. And so how do police departments navigate, this idea of making sure that they're preserving public safety, but at the same time, sometimes people get out of hand. How should they respond, Alan? What did you learn?
Yes, I mean, I won't say that I can come up with a definitive answer of what they should do. I will say that one of the crowd policing experts I spoke to here in the U.S. gave what I thought was kind of the best argument for, think about what the police officers have to deal with, right? They show up at a protest and they don't know what could happen. It could be, just it could end well, or it could turn badly. I mean, there could be, as you say, some violence, and she said basically, think about how complicated a simple traffic stop can be, right? How much of the situation can change depending on how the person responds, how the police officer responds, and how that can get out of control. And she said, well, you multiply that by thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands, and that can be sometimes what police officers face on the front lines. But I think it does make a big difference, as both the police chiefs I interviewed pointed out. It makes a big difference as to just what the police, wear or are prepared or, go in with a mindset of doing. And so I will say that is, I think, is one important factor in how things turn out is, what do the police see their role as playing and how are they prepared? What uniforms they wear, whether they go in with helmets and goggles and shields and batons, or do they, wear their, regular uniforms with their name card and ID numbers out and just go in prepared to talk. I think the police chiefs I spoke to said that can make a huge difference when it comes to how people respond.
Alan Hughes, a reporter for the Pulse, a health and science show for member station WHYY. We're talking with him today because he's reported stories about Hong Kong for WHYY and This American Life. Again, this is Chinese territory that has seen demonstrations, some violent over the last 6 months, pro-democracy demonstrations. Alan, you wanted to learn more about this, again, this divide between some Hong Kong residents and the police. So you sat down with a retired police officer in Hong Kong and his son.
Yes, so this is kind of a personal story for me. The very first police officer I ever knew growing up was my friend's father, and I sort of kind of lost touch with them a little bit, especially when I went to the US. But I've been following my friend on social media, and I know that he is in favor of the protests and in fact has been to many of them. But I also know that, his father is a recently retired police officer. And so I thought that I had heard a lot about there being a generational divide between protesters and maybe people of their parents' generation when it comes to how they view the protests. And so I thought, well, here's my friend and his father. They belong to different generations, but also my friend's father is also a police officer, has been so for many years. And I thought, well, what do they think separately about the protests, and what would they talk to if they could talk to each other? Because I've been hearing also a lot about how, the police have sort of they really are like very anti-protest at this point, and the protesters also have no love for the police. And so I thought, well, here's a family. I know that they both love and respect each other. They in fact live together. And so I thought, well, what would happen if I got them to sit down and talk to each other?
And what did happen, Alan?
Well, so my friend and I were both kind of nervous. We knew that my friend's father was, very pro-police and very firmly in that camp. And at first, so normally they don't really talk about this as much. I think they've both recognized, and their mother have recognized that this is kind of a touchy point for everyone involved. And so at first they kind of talked around the issue. They talked about it in sort of abstract terms. This is, what they think about the protests and this is what's happening. But then later on, it got a little bit more personal because they recognized that, we're talking about the protesters, but he was one of them sitting right there. And then the father said that, well, the police have a right to arrest them. It's kind of hard to tell who are the people who are, doing the violent acts and who are the people who are, like his son, like my friend, just there supporting the protesters. And so he kind of said that, if he were there, he might, be open to arresting him. And so I think, but then the whole family also recognized that, that they could have pushed this discussion further, but then they obviously didn't want to start an argument, and then everyone just backed off. But it did get a little bit more contentious as the discussion continued.
We're going to link to your story, WNPR.org/where we live. Again, Alan Yu, a reporter for The Pulse. So we just have a couple of minutes left. I wanted to go back to my other guest, Yuen Chan, senior lecturer in the Department of Journalism at the City University of London. Yuen, we talked again about this. It seemed to be a turning point, these local elections. Again, pro-democracy candidates getting a lot of support, record turnout. What will you be looking for in the weeks ahead? Is this movement able to be sustained, do you think?
Well, around a few months ago, if you had asked me there would be no way that I could have predicted that the protests would still be going on when they started. And so it's really very hard to make predictions. I think it's far from over. People feel that they've sacrificed too much and in a way got too little out of it to go home and to just get off the streets. I think that these elections do present a possibility for the government. They have said that they're listening humbly, that they respect the result. And so everybody will be looking to see, what will they actually do in practice to listen humbly and respect the result. The people have spoken very clearly that at the end of the day, the Hong Kong government hands are also tied by what Beijing will permit it to do. So it's very hard to predict what will happen going forward. It will be interesting to see. We will have more elections next year for the Legislative Council, which has far more power than these district councillors do. Will the movement be able to avoid the kind of infighting that characterized what happened after 2014 is kind of key to how the movement can sustain and not fracture. So those are the kinds of things that I think most of us will be looking at.
And then also, Yuen, just real quick, could Hong Kong ever be fully autonomous from China? Is that something that could ever be in reality?
Well, I think it's important to note that people are asking for meaningful autonomy, the high level of autonomy that they were promised when Hong Kong's sovereignty was handed over to China in 1997. And that means the idea of Hong Kong people running Hong Kong. At the time, Hong Kong people were given the understanding that they would run all their affairs except for in the areas of defense and national security and foreign relations. So it's important to know, and because especially a lot of people, a lot of commentators on the mainland have tried to paint these current protests as an attempt to split Hong Kong from China, as an attempt to get Hong Kong independence. And I think it's very important to note that Hong Kong independence has never really been a main rallying cry at all of these protests, and that what people want is to have the meaningful autonomy of running their day-to-day affairs.
And Yuen, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us. Yuen Chan, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Journalism at the City University of London. Also, thanks to Alan Yu, reporter for The Pulse at WHYY. Today's show produced by Carmen Baskoff. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Thanks for listening.